In this episode, we spoke to David Whitmore about the 4 reasons why projects fail. David has worked on major projects throughout his 40-year career, largely in defense, nuclear, and energy, but also other related sectors. Having started as an apprentice, which he highly recommends, he has worked at all levels of project management, including at exec level, where he has held director roles at Rolls-Royce, Horizon Nuclear Power, Atkins, and now at MIGSOP Cubed. These days, he has taken a step back from delivery and spends his time thinking about why projects seem to be much harder to deliver than when he started out. His research has been undertaken in partnership with UCL, and he has presented far and wide on the topic. He believes he understands why modern projects fail and what we can do about it. Uncomfortably for project managers, he now believes that project management is the wrong approach to delivering modern projects. Well, David was fantastic. He didn't hold back. He shared openly his thoughts, his anecdotes, his stories, his real-life examples of what he was sharing in practice. And it was fascinating. It was just me flying solo on this one with no Val or no Martin, but it was their loss because David was truly fascinating. I'm not going to give away what those 4 areas are. You'll have to listen to it, but also listen to his backdrop of starting out in engineering and coming into project management and how those 2 are linked, because that's great as well. And then at the end, he kind of gives us sort of his hobbies at the moment and how he's continuously learning too. But it was great to have David on the show, and we'll definitely have him back. So folks, sit back, relax, keep liking, keep listening, and enjoy the pod. Hello, project people, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. It's absolutely amazing to be here because I don't have Val, I don't have Martin, but I have a fantastic guest today in Mr. David Whitmore. David, how are you?
I'm great, Dale. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. We always joke with Val and Martin, the banter goes back and forth, but we do miss them. We do miss them both, and we wish them well. I know Val's not feeling the greatest, but he's on the other side of the world, so we'll forget about him for the next hour or so, David, and get stuck into you, because you have lots of experience. I think the title of this episode is fascinating as well, the 4 reasons why projects fail. But before we get into those 4 reasons, for those that don't know you, what's your origin story? How did you get into projects? Did you always want to fall into projects?
Wow, that's going back a way. So no, I guess not. It was engineering that kind of drew me into industry. I liked designing and building things, and that's where I started out in the high power electrical transmission sector. Working on the design and development of circuit breakers. And then I found an opportunity in Rolls-Royce submarines in the UK. And so I took that, again, engineering. But then after about probably halfway through, I was there for 20 years, halfway through, I kind of dropped into project management, I suppose. I've sort of been there ever since. So, project manager, head of projects and programs at Rolls-Royce Submarines. Left Rolls-Royce Submarines as the director, strategy implementation director, as it was called, which was really about introducing program management, the early days of program management, really, this idea of thinking of projects collectively in a program and ultimately in a portfolio. And so 20 years then in nuclear submarine industry, and after that, I moved on to the civil side. So it was around about the time, 2006, when the UK was about to embark on building loads of new nuclear reactors. We'll start with 3 nuclear power stations and we'll do another 3 after that. So I thought it'd be great to get into civil nuclear. So I joined engineering consultant Atkins and kind of had a mixed role around engineering and project delivery, but really focusing on the major project side of things. So that was when my interest in major projects really started to grow. Of course, we didn't build 6 nuclear reactors, nuclear power stations. We didn't build 3. We're still halfway through 1, I guess. But it was an interesting ride, and started, that kind of, why do we struggle to do these things? Why haven't we built 3 nuclear power stations? Why aren't we building 6 now? And along the way, I spent a year with one of those companies that was building one of those nuclear power stations. That was Horizon Nuclear Power. They were going to build nuclear power stations at Wilver and Oldbury. I was the engineering director for that project at Wilver. So I've always had this thing of stepping between engineering and project management, I suppose, along the way. So it was a great sadness to me when the Wilver project ended. And maybe it will resurrect one day. Who knows? But that was a year spent getting that project off the ground and building their capability, which was really interesting. And then after Atkins, I joined MIGSO-PQ, so the dark side, as you call it, Dale, the management consultancy world. So working around the sort of broader energy and utilities sector, but still big footprint around nuclear, helping particularly with project management. So how can we improve project management, helping clients to deliver project management in and around that major project space in energy and utilities. And so, yeah, I've been there since 2016. Semi-retired now, but to be honest, I've never been quite so busy. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure. I think retirement just means you get paid less for doing more, actually. So, yeah, I'm very busy and really enjoying it, actually. It's a good mix now. So it enables me to focus a bit more on the research side of things. So I really can start to answer that question now. Why do we struggle with these big projects?
Yeah, fantastic. And that's such an amazing origin story. Every time I get a new guest on the show and listen to the origin story, it always fascinates me at how varied everyone's background is. And people, as you were saying, you fall into project management,
Yeah.
And often I think, I've said it before, where we get into projects, programs, portfolios, and they get bigger and bigger, and we try and simplify them. And sometimes we oversimplify them. We forget that they're this one big ecosystem. And you think, often engineering's engineering, project management, controls is controls. And, you separate it so much and you forget they're all so interlinked. We had an episode quite a bit of time back now. We spoke about, systems engineering versus project management and the overlaps in that. So it's fascinating that you bring up your background there. And I mean, you talk about the nuclear sector, and we could probably go down rabbit holes on your experiences there. But submarines as well, something I've done in my past, worked on subs as well, which is fascinating. But I don't want to take up all of the time on just sort of nostalgia and anecdotes on sort of career. I want to get stuck in, because 4 reasons why projects fail is a very, very appetizing title, if I can call it that, because I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast is going, okay, David, are there only 4 reasons? What are those 4 reasons? And how did you get to those 4 reasons?
Well, spoiler alert, there are more than 4. But we think there's 4 that are particularly important and relevant. And perhaps before I do, I think you're touching on the point of falling into project management is really interesting, actually. I mean, I'll tell this story because it becomes relevant later. And I always reflect on, people tell me project management's a career. And I think, well, is it? Or is it a capability that people have? So you might be a financial expert, you might be an engineer, anything really. But in any of those professions, any of those worlds, they end up doing projects. And I remember when I worked on the submarine side, when I worked for a company called Rolls-Royce and Associates that designed and built the nuclear reactor, subsequently became Rolls-Royce Submarines as it is today. When I joined, which would be in 1986. So we're going back away, and that's important too. the people that led the projects were called project engineers. And these were really senior people. They would direct board reports. They would probably want a title like executive project director these days, but they were happy with project engineer. And they were engineers. That's what they were. You know, they could probably design and build those reactors. But they led the project, and they used project management techniques to do that. And when it came to managing the risk, wow, they got a great appreciation of the risk, because, you know, they really understood the detail behind it. And then around about the same time, the idea of the project management profession started to kind of knock around in the background. And those same people wanted to be recognised as project managers. And I think, you know, project manager sounded better than project engineer, sounded better in the pub when you were telling your mates what you did. But nevertheless, they became project managers, and then more project managers started to appear, and they started to think, well, what is this project management? And they started to read the bodies of knowledge and things like that. And rather than the approach they had always adopted, which, by the way, had been very successful in building submarine reactors and onshore testing facilities, they started to say, oh, well, we've got to do this. You know, we need one of these logs, and we need this. And they started to become project managers. And you know what? The projects didn't go so well. And we created a little bit of a distance between the engineers and this new breed called the project managers, who more and more became experts in project management and less experts in the technology that they were helping to deliver. And when I took responsibility for the project management profession in what's then Rolls-Royce Submarines, I guess, we'd got a problem. Our project delivery was being criticised by the MOD, the UK MOD, that was the principal client. And that had never been the case in the past. So that was always interesting to me, that project engineers became project managers and stopped focusing so much on the engineering and a bit more on the metrics and the plans and the schedules and making sure they got great project management. But they created a disconnect with the engineering community. And certainly in Rolls-Royce at the time, we had they were two distinct factions, you know. The engineers didn't like the bean counters, and the project managers thought the engineers just wanted to build their pet solutions. And we created this cultural gap as well. So I've always been fascinated by project management as a career, as a profession, and whether we've lost something in just treating it as a function, that the chief engineers, you even get the inversion where you've got a really, really senior chief engineer and a really, really junior project manager, and the organisation chart says the project manager's in charge. Well, they aren't. They're never going to be, because that chief engineer knows the product inside out and knows every decision that needs to be made to perfect it and get it into service. And the project manager telling them that they're not going to do it that way is a bit of a challenge. So, yeah, it's interesting. And I think, you know, it's something for us to reflect on as project managers, that is it a career or is it a tool, an enabling function that delivers financial projects, engineering projects, or social projects, or whatever they happen to be. I don't know if you want to reflect on that, Dale, but I was setting that up because I'll come back to it. To the end of the story.
I think it's worth reflecting on, because those listening to this are going, hell, David, you're actually right. Because, you know, if you have a project manager that essentially doesn't understand what they're delivering, right? And just going by the theory of, I need this task done that I don't understand by this date, and then just trying to squeeze as much out of the people doing the actual stuff that know what they're doing, what value does that add to project delivery, right?
Yeah.
And the best project managers, project directors that I've worked with understand what they're trying to deliver, the technical solution as well as the outcome. Yes, you got to understand the other elements like cost and schedule and the contract and how to manage people, etc. But I feel like, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, I think project management should be a skill or capability, because the more and more I work with PMs, and I don't think I'm doing a disservice to them, the more I work with PMs that purely just go by the book, they're just literally people managers. They're just telling people what to do based on some schedule somewhere, that they don't fully, truly understand. So if you're a PM listening to this podcast, go and try and understand what's actually happening. So I did a fascinating episode with Joe Little a couple of episodes ago. And he was saying that as a PM, the first thing he did as an APM, he went and he sat with the engineers and he actually took engineering exams and tried to understand everything from systems engineering, the life cycles, the works, and spent as much time with them as he could. So when it came to delivery, he knew what they were going through and he could empathize with them. And you could see through their lens what they were going through. Due to that, they would work better with him as a PM, right? So there's huge lessons to be learned out of that. So I 100% agree with you. I think if Val was on here, he'd agree with you as well. Where does that leave us, though, with where the PM fits in? Because if we're saying it's just a capability rather than a career or a role, so to speak, a bona fide role, are they redundant? Dare I say? Being a little bit provocative here.
Well, as a project management consultant working for a project management consultancy, then they're absolutely not redundant, and they have a tremendous value to play. And of course, I guess the only thing I'm challenging is, why does the project manager become the project leader? Because what the project manager is really great at is forecasting things that nobody else can see. So, you use earned value. You use S-curves to say, I know you guys think you're on track, but I know you're not, right? So we need to do something about that. But does that make the project manager the project leader? And I don't think it does. And I think, I've said project managers don't make great project leaders. Great leaders make great project leaders. And I don't think it really matters where the leader of the project comes from, and it might change through the various stages of the project lifecycle. But the project management role and the PMO role remains constant throughout that, which is to put their arms around the data. And one of the 4 reasons is they're not putting their arms around all of the data, and make predictions that nobody else can see. That's why we do risk analysis. That's why we do earned value analysis. We use tools that are a little bit magic, because people think they're okay, but actually they're not, and they don't realise they're not, and that's when the real value of the project manager comes into play. And I've never got away from the thought that if it's an engineering project, the engineer, the chief engineer, and the project manager, it's a duopoly. And I know people don't like that word, but they've just got to work together, because at one stage the project manager's got to take the lead, and at other times the chief engineer's got to take the lead.
Here's another one to throw in the mix for you, David. I was recently discussing with someone that, you know what, you actually don't need project controls as a function if the project managers did everything correctly and they knew what to do. You're talking about S-curves and EVA and analysis and data and things like that. A lot of people, organizations think that's the project controls functions thing to do, but use tech these days. A lot of technology can do what the project controls team does. And if you're then giving that to the PM to analyze, then you don't need project controls. And I am a project controls professional saying, actually, we could soon be redundant. And that's great. I think it's fantastic, because there are not enough individuals and technology can do things far faster. But the other thing that you remind me of, we had a discussion, I think it was with Dave Snowden quite some time back, this notion of throughout the different life cycle stages of a project, having different project crews that lead dependent on the life cycle stage you're in. And that's something you're alluding to there. Perhaps in the engineering design phase, right? It's in the engineering department that leads the project at that stage, right? Whilst there's a PM perhaps throughout, they're not necessarily always leading that stage, but they're the constant that makes sure that everything is in alignment. I don't know where you sit with that thought, but just something to throw in the mix there as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the things I'll talk about is agile. And the whole project, I think, needs to be agile. And that means not just in terms of its processes, but actually its organisation as well. It's got to adapt and evolve, and sometimes very quickly, because there's a problem or there's an opportunity. And you've got to evolve the organisation and not stifle it through its command and control structure. And the more complex the projects, the more likely you're going to find something tomorrow you didn't expect today. And if your organisation can't adapt quickly enough, then you're just not going to have the right people doing the right things to take advantage or treat that issue. So I agree absolutely. I think fluid, flexible project organisations are essential because most projects just aren't linear. They're just not simple. They're complex and messy and, move in several directions at once. So your organisation's got to do the same thing, actually.
Yeah, 100%. Well, look, we've kept the audience waiting for almost 20 odd minutes on what these four things are that make projects fail. Do you want to dive into them?
Yeah. So, are there more than four was your question before we got distracted onto the role of the project manager. So, yeah, there's more than four. Of course, there's more than four. Projects are unique. They succeed and fail in unique ways. And what we've done, so where did this start? This starts with a view, a perception perhaps, that certainly in the UK, and our focus is the UK, I think that's important to caveat what I'm going to say. There's a trend of major project performance deteriorating over time. And there is evidence behind that. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority in the UK publishes an annual major project report. And they've been doing it now for about 11 years, I think. And almost each year, progressively, it's got more and more red and less green in their assessment. You could sort of say 48% green when they started to 11% green now. And that's over 10, 11 years. And it's not, we're not comparing apples and apples because that portfolio of projects changes over time. So maybe the projects are getting harder that are coming into the portfolio. But we also talk to the project management community, and we've carried out some surveys. Carried out a survey of the nuclear project management community. And we asked the project managers who were delivering these projects, are you confident you will deliver your project successfully? And you know what? 80% of them said no. So that's a bit shocking, but it reinforces the perception that there is a deteriorating trend in major project performance in the UK. So we thought we should look at that. A project management consultancy, we should look at that. We should understand that, both because it's a conversation we need to have around the industry or community, but also it's an opportunity for us because if we can work out what it is, then we can provide a service to fill that gap. So we looked at over 80 reports or projects that have been carried out looking into major project performance. There were things like the Institution of Civil Engineers Project 13 project, which looked at project performance and came up with some reasons or some ideas to ensure success. We looked at things like the EU mega project, which was a similar thing, but looking at EU major projects, mega project, and a range of other things. We looked at various National Audit Office reports and so on and so forth. And what we found from that was, yes, there are many reasons why those projects fail. They tend to be public sector projects because that's what gets reviewed and reported. But what we found was, time and time again, four things repeated throughout those projects that could either be classed as failed, stopped, or you know, didn't achieve their stated performance levels or simply underperformed in terms of cost and time. And those four things were the way in which business-to-business relationships were built and sustained throughout the project lifecycle. We found many examples of particularly the customer and the supplier falling out and almost becoming antagonistic towards each other, and the project followed track and failed from that point onwards. The second one that we found was the speed of decision making. Now, people talk quite a lot about the planning system and how slow the planning system can be. We're not talking about that. We're talking about once that's done and the project's set up and given the green light, then it's hampered by its own ability to make rapid decisions. Maybe because it has to go back into the planning system because it's such a significant change that it needs to go around that loop again. But we find that projects can't make decisions fast enough to mitigate risks. So the risks either impact or opportunities are not realised. The third factor we found is one of complexity. Projects are more complex, and I don't think people would debate that. People will argue whether it's complex or complicated, and in a way that doesn't matter. What we're talking about is the technology that the projects are delivering has got more interdependencies and is more interlinked. And you can get to a certain level of complexity where the number of interactions is such that actually you can't resolve one without creating more than one problem from doing that. So they get to a level of complexity where actually they're almost impossible to resolve. And we found that where projects modularize the technology, they simplify the levels of complexity, and at least they can constrain one issue impacting the whole system, and they can contain it through modular design, which also then gives them the ability to adopt agile techniques, because modular design and agile are very, very closely related. And the final one, not surprisingly, is digital. But what we found with digital, and this is when I come back to the point that the project managers don't manage all the data, is that the systems are not integrated horizontally across the project. The individual digital systems are excellent. There's no question about that. But actually, are they sharing data laterally across the project? And the biggest example is where we've got a building information model for the engineers and the project scheduling tool, for example, for the project managers. And more now, the engineering tools have got time and cost data in it, which isn't shared with the project tools. So it's this integration, it's this productivity, digital productivity across the various systems. And so those are the four. Those are the four that we find recurring time and time again in the various reports and projects that we've looked at.
How do we? So first off, I'd say it's fascinating, and just listening to you there, I'm going, yep. I'm just nodding, and I'm trying to think of ways on which I can try and even throw in a spanner in the works and give those that go, I disagree with you, David, something to think about, but I can't really. And you start with the first one where, you say you're sort of client, perhaps contractor, and maybe further down the supply chain all falling out. And for me, those behaviors all stem around those commercial behaviors around the contract. Yet, we think and we believe and we like to believe that NEC solves all of it, right? But the contract doesn't always solve all of it. It's the behaviors that you exhibit based on that contract. And let's face it, regardless of which option you have in NEC or whether you have a different form of contract, if you don't actually actively exhibit the right behaviors, there'll always be some commercial tension. Now, sometimes that commercial tension is good, but if we don't use it correctly, the victim is actually the project and the outcomes for which that project serves, the people, the public, as you say, predominantly, public projects. I guess those listening to this is going, well, David, how do we solve it if that's one of the main failures?
And that's why we need project management consultants now, because we can think about these things and suggest solutions. For me, the real key to all of those is the relationships, because there's a kind of, for me, a human kind of perspective that says, if you pick the right people with the right capability and they work collaboratively together with a real vision to deliver the objectives of the project, then you know what? They'll probably solve the other things. They'll find a way of integrating the digital systems. They'll find a way of making faster decisions. So I would always start with, have you got the right relationships on the project? And the point about contracts is just brilliant, because if you look at a part of the world that is currently being more successful at delivering major projects, and it's the Middle East and the Far East, then they see the relationship between relationships and contracts in the opposite way to the way we see them in the West. The relationship comes first, and the contract is just a means of expressing how the relationship's going to operate. And in the end, a contract is just an agreement to have a relationship. That's really all it is. But quite often in the UK, in particular, the contract is defined before you've even got a relationship. And sometimes when we tender, well, almost always, I think, when we tender competitively, we've got the contract in the tender documents. This is the contract that we're going to have. So the contract pays no regard to the type of relationship that you might need to have with the chosen, let's call them partners, suppliers, whatever they are. And the research that we've done, and it's worth saying at this point that we've acquired the assets of a company that carried out research over the last 20 years into this topic of business-to-business relationships. And we're now extending that, working with UCL University in London. And what that research tells us is that there are 7 what we call dimensions of business-to-business relationships. And in the West, in the UK in particular, most leaders only recognise and treat 2 of those dimensions. And the 2 that they focus on are the contract, or the nature of the contract, and the interpersonal relationships. So if they need to fix something, it's either pick the phone up and talk to somebody, or look at the contract and send them a letter. And so, obviously, what are the other 5?
Yeah.
So the first one is the selection of the partner, and this comes back to, don't think about the contract till you've selected the partner, and think about why you want a partner. Because if you look at the engineering contractors, particularly around the UK, the engineering consultants, they're all really good. It's why are you assessing their capability in the tender? They're all really good. What you want is for them to want to work with you, so they put the best people and do the best work and put their resources behind it. So you want a relationship with them. So you should be thinking about who can you build the best relationship with when you're selecting those suppliers, partners. The second one is the nature of the contract. So having selected the partners, what kind of contract do you need to get those relationships to work? And then you can get going. And as you work, you will need to agree the ways of working. So that's the third. You will need to understand each other. And that's a key. Why does that company want to work with us to deliver this project? What's their objective here, and how can we facilitate that? And equally, they need to understand what we want to get out of it, which won't necessarily just be the delivery of the project. Maybe that company is doing it because they want to build capability. So how can we help them to build capability? Where are we now? 4th one, I think. 5th one. We'll do a head count when we finish. Is dealing with problems. And it's amazing to me that people don't put a lot of thought into dealing with problems. And I went to a major project association event here in the UK a few years back, And it was a guy from the military who was talking about they make plans to engage in a battle, but they assume straight away that that plan's not going to work. And they're always thinking about, well, what are we going to do when we have problems? How are we going to, and they practice what they're going to do and have problems. In projects, we don't really think too much about how we're going to deal with problems. We either assume the contractor will take care of it, or we go into some kind of reactionary mode when the problem happens, which probably starts with shouting at somebody else because they made a mistake. Why did, rather than, here's a problem, actually it's an opportunity to build the relationship and make the project succeed. And people feel good when they solve problems and relationships get better. So really put thought into how you're going to deal with problems, who you're going to bring in, what's the processes you're going to use, what resources do you need. And then the final one, so we must be up to 7 now, is measuring the relationship, the performance management relationship. And very, very few people, and we've looked now at many, many projects, very, very few projects measure relationships. So they'll tell you trust is broken down or trust is important, but they can't tell you what it is. Is it 7? Is it 2? Does it matter? And when we work with them, they become quite passionate about whether it's a 7 or a 6, and they'll demand it's a 6.5. You see, you can't do that. It's a 7 or a 6. So when they learn to measure it, they become quite passionate about it. But there's very few projects that are measuring those relationships. So there's a whole landscape of relationships. Which are the critical ones? How are they performing? What do we do for the ones that are deteriorating? Mm-hmm. Let's intervene before it becomes a problem. So those are the 7, and we tend to try and manage relationships with interpersonal relationships and contracts, which
it's really interesting. You talk about measuring
the Far East and the Middle East.
Yeah, you talk about measuring relationships, right? I don't think I've really come across people that actively go out to measure relationships.
Yeah.
But what we do know on projects is what gets measured gets managed. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the beauty of actually putting a focal point on, are you actively managing your relationships? And everything you've said there makes sense. I guess for some of those listening to that, do you have some real life examples, without incriminating yourself, where actively looking at relationships overcame those behaviors that you often find in these commercial customer-client relationships?
Yeah. I'll give you 2. First one is personal experience. So I said we've acquired the assets of a company. The first time I worked with that company was when I was at Rolls-Royce Submarines, and I'd just set up. We were bringing in technical partners, engineering partners, to help us with an expanding workload, and they were going to take on some of the engineering design and analysis of the reactor plant design. So, big thing, there was a lot of resistance to that in the business at the time. But we got a massively expanding workload, great opportunity, and we needed to take on that broader scope. So we tendered and we selected 2 companies, one of which was Atkins. So Atkins won an engineering services contract to support Rolls-Royce Submarines. And then it didn't really work. And what was happening was my engineers were saying, Atkins are no good. The engineers they give us are not up to it. They don't understand the analysis techniques. It's just not good enough. I thought, well, I don't believe that, because I know that Atkins is, one of the top engineering consultancies around. And when I spoke to Atkins, they would say, we don't understand you. You said this is strategic to you, but nobody gives us any time. Nobody wants to talk to us. We're just isolated. I thought, well, that don't make sense either, because I know, a lot of people around the business know this is important. So we got this company in, and we worked through We measured the relationship, and we understood what factors were affecting the relationship. And what it turned out to be was it was nothing to do with trust or competence or any of the things that people were talking about. It was the simple fact that we weren't sharing with them enough forward look ahead. So they didn't know what was coming up around the corner. So when we issued a task order to them, we wanted somebody by Monday who was a world-leading expert in something really complicated to do something really quickly because we've got a problem. And they were being given the impossible task. And of course, all their best engineers were doing stuff. So they had a go, and it wasn't good enough. And so it was a PMO solution. So when we started sharing in much more detail what was coming up around the corner, they started releasing their engineers because they got more time to bring them onto get them mobilised and get them familiar with the product and so on. And that was in 2000 and something, 4, let's say. And that relationship's still going strong now with Rolls-Royce Submarines and Atkins. So yeah, measuring the relationship was key to understanding what was going wrong. And the other example is nothing to do with me. It's something we've looked at and researched in detail and spoke to the people involved, which is a rail project. So it was the Stafford Area Improvement Programme, which was to build a stretcher line or improve a stretcher line from Stafford to Crewe on the West Coast Main Line route in the UK to increase the throughput trains. And from the start, they focused on relationships. So the partners were selected, or the suppliers were selected on the basis of relationships, both how they related to each other and to the client network rail. And throughout the project, the focus on relationships and innovation, that was the other thing, was really, a main feature of the project. It was early, it was under budget, and it increased the scope. And that same alliance went on to deliver, currently just finished delivering East-West Rail, the same kind of results. So I think they're really powerful examples of when you focus on relationships with competent organisations, you get great results. So those are the two I would mention.
No, they're fantastic examples as well. But it got me thinking there, if we all agree that relationships, behaviors are critical to project success, how do we, as we know, these are public projects, how do we build in a mechanism through the tendering process to measure behaviors from suppliers and score them based on their behaviors? How do we do that? Because it feels like it's highly dependent on people, and people move around, right? And, the critics among us might say, actually, if you're basing it on your relationships, you're not being fair because you're potentially giving someone that a leg up based on your relationship with them. How do you get around that one?
Well, if you come back to what we've discovered in the research, that you can measure relationships, then you can now be independent. And actually, that's what the Stafford Area Improvement Programme did. It had 2 phases of the tender. The first phase of the tender was fairly conventional, time, cost and capability. The second phase of the tender was focused on relationships and innovation. And the final tender, I think relationships had 30% of the final score. And what they did is, in workshops, the bidders, and it was reduced down to 2 at this stage, originally 3, 1 dropped out quite early, interesting. The other 2 went through workshops with Network Rail with independent assessors from a third-party organisation, assessing their behaviours and approach to relationships. So they were measuring objectively the performance of these alliances in real-world situations, scenarios that were created. And that was the score that was carried into the bid assessment. So it wasn't a person subjectively saying, I know they're really good, so I'm going to give them a 9. It was a group of independent consultants who said, right, we've been through this detailed assessment, and they get 9, and they got 6. And what they found, of course, was that time, cost, and capability scores were quite comparable. But what really was different was the behaviours and relationships score, and that's why the alliance that won that contract. And then, surprise, surprise, they won the next one because obviously they'd learned from success and outperformed again the competition.
Would you go as far as building payment mechanisms or incentives based on scores on relationships? Have you seen this in practice?
You see, I think it just becomes part of the PMO. And it's just part of the balanced scorecard. And it's a really important part of the balanced scorecard. And here's the thing, everybody agrees with me that it's a really important risk. It's a big risk to the project. But when you get the risk register out, hang on, it's not on it. So it's not a risk, is it? It's not a risk you're prepared to try and manage. And the flip side is it should be an incentive that you want to reward. So, I would say that part of the balanced scorecard for the project, a key feature should be relationship performance. And the supplier should be rewarded for good relationship performance. And that's exactly what Stafford Area Improvement Programme did. The share line was affected by that relationship score, or that behavioural score. So they really put into the share line the things they felt were important and were passionate about. And the contract they used, by the way, was the Australian Pure Alliance contract. And no claims were allowed. It was a very They said we want a relational project, so we'll have a relational contract. And that's what they did.
Yeah, it's awesome. And we talk about collaboration, and what you've just shared is collaboration in action, not just a theory. And you have evidence of it actually working. And I'm sure there's plenty of listeners that will love the fact that you've shared openly it works. There is evidence that it works. But we do need to shift gears because we've only touched on one of the 4. And I feel like I could talk to you for hours, David, and we'd probably, end up turning this one episode into 10. But I feel like out of the remaining 3, we could probably couple, and correct me if I'm wrong, you obviously can disagree with me, the speed of decision making and digital technology is kind of coupled together these days. So, yeah.
Yeah, it is. And ultimately, it's all about bringing the right information at the right time to the right people. And for me, there's 2 things in that. So there's the data. And the data is driven by the digital systems. So you need forewarning of an issue, and you need good modelling of different scenarios to make a rational decision about which way you're going to go in terms of dealing with that risk. And a lot of that will come from the data. And that's why you need connectivity between the engineering digital tool and the project digital tool. Because actually, it's no good the project scheduling tool telling you something that the engineering tools don't agree with, because you've got to connect those things together. But the other thing you need, and this is what we found when we looked at the speed of decision making, is how incredibly convoluted those decision making processes can become in a system where there are lots of players. So let's take nuclear, because I know it well, and let's compare and contrast a South Korean project or the project recently completed in the UAE with a UK project, Hinkley Point C, for example. In South Korea and the UAE, there's probably about 4 players. There's the state owner, there's the developer, there's the regulator, there's the operator. And pretty much they're doing the whole project. Obviously, one of them's bringing a pretty extended supply chain with it, but 4 key players. Same in Korea. When you look at the UK, that's the way it used to be. up to the 80s. Sizewell B was built by CGB with 3 or 4 key players that were delivering that station. Since then, we've disaggregated these organisations. We've sold off assets. Some of them are now owned by French companies, American companies, Chinese companies, and we looked at this, and instead of 4, there's about 80 key players, all stakeholders, all got some political influence over the project. And if you want to make a decision, quite often you've got to bring quite a number of those into line to agree so they don't agitate and prevent that decision from being made. So what's the tool that you need to manage that? Well, you need to make it lean. Because if you're going to try and make a decision in such a complicated stakeholder map, you need a lean decision-making process. And we looked in detail at nuclear decommissioning authority, Sellafield in the UK, and a major decision on that project on that site could take anything up to 18 months to get through the various layers of stakeholders, going back from Sellafield into the NDA, into the department, into the central government, maybe out into the regulator, maybe the various action groups were involved as well. That's no good, is it? It wasn't just that risk that impacted. There was a whole load of others that impacted while you were waiting. So you've got to lean out that process so that those decisions can be made in 6 weeks. That's a long time for a project, isn't it, to make a decision? Yeah. So we've got to lean out that decision-making process, and so lean is the tool that we've got to use. And I think project managers, it's about lean, isn't it? It's about being efficient. So lean is an absolute key skill of project managers. And the first thing they need to focus on is that decision-making process. You can't take a lengthy decision-making process into a complex project. You're dead before you start if you're trying to live with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right, because often, you look at, and this is me from project controls perspective, right? If you look at the cycle of how long it takes to collect data, then produce the data, and then make sure the data is accurate, and then put that information and insight in front of decision makers, at best, it's 8 weeks old. It takes you 4 weeks to collect it, churn it out, and then another 4 weeks to get into a consumable format. And often in that process, you lose the context as well. All you see are numbers. Yeah. And it's really, really difficult. But I do think that technology does have a part to play. We've spoken to plenty of people on this podcast around how you are getting more integrated, and you do have better ways of bringing the different tool sets and systems together. Some ways are better than others, I would say. Every single episode we've done for the past 18 months, 2 years or so, has spoken about AI or machine learning in some way, shape, or form. I think that is here to stay. Is it where it needs to be right now? Probably not, no. Where are we with it? I think we are in the space where we can be a little bit predictive with it, so the range narrows in terms of where the outcomes would be, but we still have to use it with a drop of caution, because it's not the silver bullet. But also I think there's the human side, because a lot of what I think we're doing in terms of using technology these days to make decisions is based on what the computer does based on the data we have, which is typically schedule. I mean, at point of recording this podcast with you, I'm in, Washington, D.C. at the Project Controls Expo in the US. And the crazy thing, and this is similar to what's happening in the UK and elsewhere in the world, is that a lot of the technology out there is based on the schedule. Schedule and risk, those are the two. There's very little on cost. More and more so, we're looking at stuff that's, you spoke about 3D models, all these types of things coming together. But I haven't seen a truly unified platform that brings us all together from the engineering phase all the way through. It typically takes best-in-class products to be stitched together, right?
Yeah.
usually if you have a platform that is everything, it does everything okay, but it doesn't do anything particularly well in my experience. But I think it will get there, and I think that's where we're getting to. But coming back to it, I think decision making plays a very key role. Val will love this because he has been toying around with a notion for some time now about decision logs, logging decision making and their outcomes.
Mhm.
And there's two schools of thought on this, and I'd be interested to get your view, because the one school of thought is, wouldn't it be great because every single decision we make, if that was logged, we'd understand the outcome and we'd improve decision making. But would that potentially stop, whether it's the project manager or project engineer, whoever the leader is, making decisions, because now there's a risk that they'll get found out if their decision leads to failure. So there's this whole human element around decision making as well. But yeah, what are those thoughts that come to mind for you?
I'd be in the camp of that's an important project feature, actually. And I think you've got to record it. And why do you want to record it? You want to record because you need to learn. And if you don't know what you did and why, then how on earth are you going to learn whether it goes right or wrong, actually? I mean, let's assume it goes really, really well. Now you want to know that, I made that decision and look, that was me, and it went really, really well. But you learn from that, don't you? And I think if the history of the project isn't known, then your ability to learn from what happens on the project is significantly reduced. So I think people who make decisions, in my experience, are quite happy with the decisions they've made when they make them. So why wouldn't they want it recorded? So I would say that, we talk about RAID logs all the time. So, making those decisions is an important part of that RAID log. And I think they are important to enable learning from the project. So I would say yes. I mean, yeah, they should be recorded. I mean, not everything, he said this, so, I'm going to write that down. We've gone a bit too far, haven't we? But it's a key decision. I think RAID log is the right technique to use to record those decisions, because you're tracking things through from risks to decisions ultimately. And that's a good opportunity to learn.
And what about where do you sit with if we had the technology, and regardless of what the project is, because these days almost anything you can create a digital twin of it with the right will. Where do you sit with simulating outcomes when you're delivering projects? One of the things I toyed around with, but I don't think anyone, well, no listeners picked me up on it, is I said, it would be great if you worked with a client, regardless of who it is, the TFL, the Network Rail, whoever, and you said, well, we want to here's a project that we're thinking about. And before you've even started anything, you work with a gaming company, right? And you put it out there as a game. Here's the outcomes we want. And through games, you make it free. You have free research where you can have literally 10,000 iterations from people all over the world, where you simulate environmental factors, ground conditions. They can select the type of contracts they want, the type of suppliers, score them on relationships and the decisions they make and things like this. And then you end up with, let's say it's a 6-month window, you end up with a real life scenario or scenarios that you could potentially take without having started anything. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the way we have to go, but the thought of simulating outcomes before we've even gone and potentially started any design.
I'd probably look at that in two ways. And I think I agree with you. And the reason I agree is because I think that's a systems thinking model. And when I think about the digital system for the project, first of all, there's two digital systems. Let's take a systems thinking approach. there's the system of interest, which is the thing we want to make, railway, whatever it is. But then there's the enabling system, which might be a project management approach. Or I think in the old days, when I told the story about Rolls-Royce, those project engineers were using systems engineering as their enabling system. And they swapped it out for a project management enabling system that didn't work quite as well. And I think we really need to think about that enabling system, and I don't think we do at the moment. I think we say, right, here's a project, right, we need these various tools, we need these various processes, we had used these at the last project, so we'll use them on this one. And actually, I think, no. It's a complex thing you're trying to do. Take a systems thinking approach. You know the system of interest. You know what you're trying to build, but that gives you a specification. That's important. But now think really hard and innovatively about the enabling system you need to deliver it. And if it's got lots of wild permutations, then maybe you do want some kind of crowdsourcing of forecasting in some way. I've been a bit more modest in my thinking that if you can just bring all the key players together so that there's one enabling system for the whole project, rather than there's an engineering system and a project management system, and then eventually there's a poor old asset manager that's going to have an asset management system, and she takes what happens to be available at the time. But no, bring it right to the front of the project. Use a systems thinking approach, write your digital strategy, think about your digital twin. Don't assume it's going to be BIM or whatever else your kind of pet tool is. Think about the asset manager. Ultimately you need to capture that data to enable you to construct something, but fundamentally to give it to the person that's going to operate the facility or the system or whatever it is, and think about that flow. So that we did some research on this, and we found that we spoke to asset managers and said, rate the digital twin that's handed over to you at the end of the project. And they weren't very polite. They generally, 80% of them said it was just not useful to me. And a lot of them said, I was given this BIM thing, but I don't have any people that can use it. Oh, by the way, every license is £10,000 or something. I don't really want to know what's the lubricating periodicity for that thing over there. But it's buried somewhere in this big geometric model. So yeah, I think that digital system needs to be thought of holistically using systems thinking techniques by the project leaders right at the front end of the project. Don't just let the contractor bring their preferred tool in, which will really help them with construction, but might not help you with any other life cycle phases of the project. And for me, that's where AI really is going to play a role. We've got all of these digital tools that have got data buried in them, but they won't talk. You're not going to get Revit to talk to Primavera because Autodesk and Oracle are not going to open their APIs to each other so they can steal their proprietary technology. So they're closed systems for commercial reasons. But maybe AI can take the data from the various sources and actually help us to construct them all. And if it told us that the engineers think they can build this for, £5,000 in 6 months, and the project managers think it should be 3 months and £2,000, so that's a really interesting thing to know from a project perspective. So the more we put data into the engineering models, the more we've got to find a way of integrating it with the project management models, because there's two ways of thinking about the project now, and the two do not agree.
Yeah,
I really like the idea of the gaming system because they are interconnected, aren't they? I mean, they are designing worlds in 3D environments, and crowdsourcing of intelligence is really interesting. Probably can't do it with nuclear submarines, but
Yeah,
I'm sure you can do it with some other things.
perhaps not for all projects. Some need
Yeah.
security clearances and the like. But I think, there's already the platform, and perhaps will encourage more people to enter the profession.
Yeah.
Because you were saying
Right.
earlier, project engineer title versus project manager. I know very few project managers that say loud and proudly these days at a dinner party, I'm a project manager, right? It's lost its appeal slightly because the project manager generally gets all the blame when things go wrong. And perhaps that's something we need to look at as well. But the other one that you did have is complexity that we haven't. I mean, it's all interlinked, right? It's not the these reasons why projects fail. These four reasons, they don't happen in isolation. They sort of all interlinked, and often it's a combination of a host of them. But I think what you're saying is these are the four sort of ones that bubble to the top. And complexity is easy. It's easy to decomplexify, if I can make up a word. Because you say you just modularize it, but can all projects be modularized? Because some might say to you, actually, David, not everything can be modularized. But then there's this other notion, and if you humor me for a little bit, I was speaking to someone, and the APM, PMI, a lot of the bodies of knowledge, they put up this loosely. The definition of a project is a unique endeavor with a definite start and a definite end. And I challenge that because I used to believe that that's what we all studied. Is it truly unique? Because for me, a large part of a project, and most stats are made up, I guess. But if I can make one up, let's say 75 to 80% of any project is step and repeat from something that's happened before. The truly unique bit is very, very small. Let's say 15 to 25% at max. And so that little bit is where all of the risks lie and all of the opportunities. And so for me, yes, you can modularize the stuff that has happened before. That would be my view on it. So then the question then becomes, can you modularize the truly unique bits of a project too?
Yeah. And I'm just trying to. I mean, it's interesting to see the way the nuclear industry is going, from large reactors to small modular reactors, and the idea that the reactor itself is made as a module off-site and then brought onto site, and the construction activity takes place independently of the nuclear system, which really simplifies that whole process because the site doesn't have to reach nuclear cleanliness standards or quality standards even until you're ready to bring the nuclear components on site. Some systems are inherently modular. A railway is inherently modular. A highway is inherently modular. And it goes back to the designers, doesn't it? I think you can design any system to be modular, or you can design any system to be integrated. And I've kind of gone from one to the other on this, because when I started out as a designer, systems engineer, and functional analysis was my big tool. And I would try and combine as many functions as possible in one component because it made it smaller, simpler, and cheaper. But that's hellish to maintain. And it's much simpler if actually you got three components with one function each. And I've kind of gone on that journey from don't design it to be complex in terms of its functions because it's potentially going to be cheaper and simpler to make. Because actually it's going to be really difficult to maintain and even to construct in some situations. So you put better off splitting those functions into separate components because they're easier to manage from a project perspective. And this is where Bent Fleabag talks a lot about the need for modular design. And he talks about a skyscraper, for example, that doesn't look modular. But he uses the Empire State Building as the example, where every floor was almost constructed remote from the building site and brought onto site. And it was built in can't remember, but record time, on budget and with a reasonable health and safety record for the time, probably a very good health and safety record actually. So I think it comes down to the design. The design's got to be thought through so that it takes complexity into account, so that the number of interdependencies is kept below a certain level. That means you won't get this complex iteration when you start to change things. You can't change that because you've got to change 6 other things now because it's complex and interdependent. So I think that's the engineers and the project managers working in tandem again. And I think a good place to sort of close, actually, Dale, would be taking complexity to its broadest consideration, because the reason we think these 4 things are now becoming an issue is because of the complexity of the project. So not the engineering, which is specifically this aspect of trying to modularize it and use agile techniques so you can respond faster to changes and issues, and actually encouraging change in doing that. But projects now take place, yes, with more complex technology, but also in a more complex socio-political environment. And almost all aspects of life these days are more complex or complicated than they were, say, 50 years ago, where projects need to be carried out with much higher regard to health and safety, to sustainability, things like equality, diversity and inclusion, and almost every aspect of a project and the design of a team is affected by the way we now think we should treat each other, which is great, absolutely the right thing to do. But by the way, we've just made those projects we're trying to deliver more complex. And when we look back in history, generally when technology's got more complex or society's got more complex, project management's ramped up to deal with it. And you can see, they talk about the 4 industrial revolutions, and you can see, the stages of evolution of project management from kind of the first approach of, just use numbers of people and deal with it by kind of lordly command in sort of medieval times, through to the kind of creation of the civil engineering profession and the bringing of civil engineering techniques and the establishment of the ICE in the UK, for example. And then in the early 20th century, people whose names we're familiar with, like Gantt, started to appear. And as the Industrial Revolution got into that sort of 20th century phase, we ramped up again with scheduling and Taylorism and Fayol and all those kind of people came into play about the same time, around about the First World War. And then we went through another iteration in the sort of 50s, 60s, where technology started to ramp up again. And we started to see things like lean and total quality management and systems engineering, and those techniques came in. But, we've just started to define the project management. For the first time ever, we started to say, well, this is project management. And it's about schedules and costs and breakdown structures and all those kind of things. And things like lean and total quality management and systems engineering didn't get incorporated because we'd started to codify the profession. But complexity continued to ramp away. So this is speculation. I don't know how you prove it. But I think we're now trying to deliver 21st century complexity with mid-20th century approaches. And that's why we've developed this gap, and that's why these 4 things have become apparent. And that's why we need to treat project management as our planning model, which is great, but it doesn't deal with the socio-political complexity of which, and the technical complexity in which our projects are now delivered. And for that, you need to think much more about psychology, the relationships. You need to think about how you make fast decisions in such a complex model. You need to think about how you can simplify the technology you're trying to deliver through agile and modularity. And you need to integrate those digital systems, to your point, Dale, to give the decision makers the right information at the right time. And until we do that, I think we're going to be struggling with overly complex things with simple techniques that can't handle it. And that's why we think there's a complexity gap that these four things cover. So that's the theory. That's the big theory.
Wow, what a way to sort of head towards the end of the pod. And I think you've teed us up perfectly. We'd love to have you back, David, on, the complexity gap. There you go. There's the title for the next one, and how to sort of close it. But so usually at the end of the pod, when we have a guest for the first time, Martin is on here going through Fiverr, which is a quick fire quiz, all about yourself. But I'm going to do something different because I can see on screen you've got sort of behind you, there's a ship and there's a car, there's a couple of guitars as well. Do you have sort of a guilty pleasure with music?
Yeah. So first of all, the ship is the Titanic. So I must have this hang up with things that fail. So, there's a failed project right there. Nobody talks about the Olympic that operated successfully for however long, the sister ship and all the rest of it. But I do like my music. So I was a child of the 70s, I suppose. I grew up in the 70s with, everything was challenging. Are you prog rock? Are you punk rock? Are you, new romantics or whatever you were? And so it's always been, I want to be a rocker at some point. So I've got the guitars. I can play one of them, all right. The bass guitar is a complete mystery to me. It's got 2 strings missing. I don't really know what that's all about. And the acoustic guitar that's just for experts, isn't it, really? So I'm learning. Life's a learning journey, isn't it? And I'm a baby when it comes to guitars.
100%. It's continuous learning. We never stop learning. But you're better than me. I can't play guitar. So well done.
You've not heard me.
Well, at least
silence might well be the better option.
Yeah. Well, perhaps when you come on the next episode, you'll have learned a tune, and we can use that as the intro music. And then also, I see you've got some books behind you as well, and perhaps for the listeners, what are you reading at the moment?
Oh, what am I reading? So I'm currently reading a book by Tim Harford called The Undercover Economist, I think it is. And I've there's this thing coming into retirement when you start to reflect back on life and you think, well, I didn't do all of those things that I should have done, so now I better do them. Like learning to play the guitar, for example. But as I've sort of studied more and more about project management, it's things like, well, economics is quite important, isn't it, in delivering projects, and psychology is quite important because there's quite a lot of people around when you're delivering a project. So I've started trying to catch up really with some of that stuff. So, I thought projects were hard, but economics is just stupid. I can't get my head around that. It's like whatever you think the answer is going to be, it's the opposite. And then you read it in detail and they explain it. You think, oh yeah, okay, I can sort of see that now. It's the same with psychology. People are just weird, aren't they? What drives people to do things is, I'll never understand that. That's for sure. But I'm going to try and find out a little bit.
It's fascinating having you on the pod, Tim. I don't know why I called you Tim, David. But no, it's
Tim
fascinating
Harford.
having. Sorry,
Tim Harford, the undercover economist.
There you go. But no, it's absolutely fascinating having you on. I think what you've shared with us, with the listeners. There's a lot to think about, a lot to ponder. So thank you for sharing that so openly as well. But before we let you go, are there any final thoughts that you want to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, I think it's a great time. You talked about people coming into the profession, and it's just a great time to come into the profession. And it's no good saying it on this kind of audience, is it? Because we're already in it.
Yeah.
But we need to go out there and tell people about it because whatever you read in the papers, particularly in the UK at the moment, we're going to build great projects. No, I'll rephrase that. We've got to build great projects because we see the need to do remarkable things. We're going to limit global temperature rise and deal with climate change, and we're going to do that through projects, aren't we? Nobody else is going to do it. We need systems that don't burn carbon to achieve that. We want to improve, the welfare and the health and the things that we're setting ourselves, the goals, particularly in the UK for 2050. It's 25 years away. And I go back to we were building 6 nuclear power stations 25 years ago, and now we're building half of one. We tried to build a railway, and now we're building half of one. In the next 25 years, we're going to do remarkable things, and we need great people doing things in new ways to do that. So I think it's just a fantastic time to be in and around this profession, and to, we're going to make a future for our grandchildren, aren't we? And it's at the end of the day, it's going to come down when the politicians and the investors have worked it all out. It's going to come down to us to make it happen, and it's always been that way, hasn't it? And I think it's just going to be a fabulous 25 years to experience.
What a fascinating advertisement for anyone looking to get into project management. And as you're saying, this podcast, you're probably talking to the converted. But if you're listening to this episode, please go out there, talk to your friends, your family, anyone interested in getting involved, because we truly, every project I've worked on, every project professional that I've worked with has spoken about what they're working on and the outcomes that project has. And it's truly remarkable, because every project exists for an outcome that actually serves to benefit humans, i.e. us. So David, thank you so much for your time. I know why I called you Tim, because usually Val gets names wrong of our guests. So I'm just making Val feel at home when he listens back to this episode. But no, it's been an absolute privilege and pleasure to have you, David. And like I say, we'd love to have you back in the future. But look, folks, that is the end of this episode. So if you like what you've heard, please do help us pay it forward and share a link to this episode on your favorite social media. Once again, a massive thank you to our guest, David Whitmore, and thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me, an absent Val and an absent Martin, it's bye for now.